Democracy's greatest threat has never been the external enemy battering at the gates, but the internal erosion of the very virtues that sustain free societies. Having witnessed the collapse of the Weimar Republic and observed the subtle mechanisms by which free people surrender their liberty, I can attest that democracies rarely die from violent coups. They commit suicide through 1,000 small compromises with authoritarian impulses. The most chilling aspect of democratic collapse is its gradualism. Citizens wake up one morning to find their freedoms gone, yet cannot pinpoint the exact moment of surrender. This is because democracy dies not through dramatic revolution, but through the quiet abandonment of intellectual honesty, the erosion of institutional respect, and the seductive embrace of ideological certainty over empirical inquiry. Today's America exhibits troubling symptoms that historical analysis reveals as precursors to democratic breakdown: the polarization of discourse into irreconcilable camps, the weaponization of institutions for partisan advantage, the rejection of shared epistemic standards, and perhaps most dangerously, the growing comfort with authoritarian solutions when democracy produces outcomes we dislike. The tragedy is that democracy's defenders often accelerate its demise by abandoning democratic principles in the name of protecting democracy. This paradox, that democracy can be destroyed by those who claim to save it, represents one of the most sophisticated challenges facing modern free societies. Understanding how democracies commit suicide is the first step toward preventing it. Chapter 1: The Intellectual Abdication. The suicide of democracy begins not in the streets or voting booths, but in the minds of intellectuals who abandon their critical function in favor of ideological conformity. My analysis of how French intellectuals embraced totalitarian myths in The Opium of the Intellectuals revealed a pattern that transcends national boundaries. When society's thinking classes surrender independent judgment, democratic institutions soon follow. The intellectual's primary responsibility to democracy is maintaining what I call constructive skepticism, the willingness to question prevailing orthodoxies while remaining committed to rational discourse and empirical evidence. When intellectuals become ideological partisans, they abandon this crucial role and become democracy's gravediggers rather than its guardians. Consider how quickly American universities, once bastions of free inquiry, have embraced orthodoxies that suppress dissenting viewpoints. The transformation is subtle but decisive. Rather than fostering environments where ideas compete on their merits, these institutions increasingly police thought according to predetermined political conclusions. This represents a fundamental betrayal of the intellectual mission. The consequences extend far beyond campus boundaries. When a society's educational institutions abandon intellectual pluralism, they produce graduates incapable of the complex reasoning democracy requires. These citizens enter public life with rigid ideological frameworks rather than analytical tools, making them susceptible to authoritarian appeals that promise simple answers to complex problems. Even more dangerous is the intellectual's growing comfort with censorship when deployed against dangerous ideas. The justification is always noble, protecting democracy from its enemies, but the result is the gradual erosion of the epistemic foundations democracy requires. Once intellectuals accept that some ideas are too dangerous for public consideration, they have abandoned the principle of open inquiry that distinguishes free societies from totalitarian ones. The historical pattern is clear. Societies that lose their capacity for genuine intellectual debate soon lose their capacity for democratic governance. When thinking becomes subordinated to ideology, politics inevitably follows, transforming from a method of managing disagreement into a weapon for imposing conformity. Chapter 2: The Polarization Trap. Democratic suicide accelerates when political competition transforms from a contest between competing visions into existential warfare between irreconcilable enemies. This polarization trap creates a logic where each side justifies increasingly extreme measures by pointing to the other side's extremism, creating a spiral that ultimately destroys the democratic center. The tragedy is that this dynamic feeds on itself. As positions become more extreme, moderate voices are marginalized as insufficiently committed to the cause. Politicians face primary challenges from ideological purists, media rewards sensationalism over nuance, and citizens retreat into information bubbles that reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. The result is a political culture where compromise becomes treason and pragmatism becomes cowardice. Historical analysis reveals that this polarization follows predictable patterns. First, political differences become moral absolutes. Opponents are not merely wrong but evil. Second, institutional norms get abandoned when they protect political enemies. Third, violence or the threat of violence enters political discourse as each side claims existential threats justify extreme measures. America's current polarization exhibits all these warning signs. Political opponents are routinely characterized not as fellow citizens with different views, but as traitors or fascists whose very participation in democratic life represents an unacceptable threat. Institutional protections like the filibuster, judicial independence, or federalism are alternately praised or condemned depending on whether they serve immediate political interests. Perhaps most dangerously, both sides have embraced versions of what I call preventive authoritarianism, the idea that democracy must be suspended temporarily to save it from its enemies. Progressive voices argue that conservative threats to democracy justify extraordinary measures like packing the Supreme Court or eliminating the Electoral College. Conservative voices argue that progressive threats to democracy justify extraordinary measures like restricting voting access or rejecting unfavorable election results. Both sides miss the fundamental point: democracy's strength lies not in any particular institutional arrangement, but in the shared commitment to resolving political disagreements through peaceful means. Once that commitment erodes, once politics becomes warfare by other means, democratic institutions become mere tools for imposing the will of the stronger faction rather than mechanisms for managing legitimate disagreement. The solution requires what seems impossible in the current climate: the recognition that democracy's survival depends on treating political opponents as legitimate participants in democratic life, even when we profoundly disagree with their positions. Chapter 3: The Tyranny of Good Intentions. Nothing threatens democracy more than citizens who believe their cause is so righteous that normal democratic constraints become obstacles to justice. This tyranny of good intentions transforms well-meaning people into democracy's unwitting destroyers, as they abandon democratic principles in pursuit of noble goals. The mechanism is seductive in its logic. If we know what is right and good, why should we allow ignorant or malicious voices to obstruct progress? If democracy produces outcomes that contradict moral truth, shouldn't moral truth take precedence? This reasoning has led countless democratic movements to embrace authoritarian means while maintaining democratic rhetoric. Contemporary America exhibits this pattern across the political spectrum. Progressive activists argue that combating racism justifies restrictions on free speech, since hate speech causes genuine harm. Conservative activists argue that protecting traditional values justifies restrictions on educational content, since moral corruption threatens social stability. Both sides claim emergency powers for their preferred level of government when standard democratic processes produce unsatisfactory results. The historical parallel is instructive. The Weimar Republic's collapse resulted not primarily from Nazi strength, but from democratic parties' willingness to abandon democratic principles when faced with crises. Social Democrats accepted restrictions on civil liberties to combat communist threats. Conservative parties accepted restrictions on parliamentary procedure to combat socialist threats. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, but collectively they hollowed out democracy's institutional protections. The tragedy is that good intentions make this erosion particularly insidious. Unlike obviously authoritarian movements that openly reject democratic values, The tyranny of good intentions maintains democratic language while abandoning democratic substance. Its advocates genuinely believe they are democracy's defenders, making them immune to arguments about democratic principles. This creates what I call the emergency exception mentality, the belief that current circumstances are so extraordinary that normal democratic constraints must be suspended. Whether the emergency is climate change, demographic transition, technological disruption, or cultural transformation, the logic remains the same: democracy is too slow and uncertain to address urgent moral imperatives. Yet this emergency exception gradually becomes the rule. Each crisis justifies further restrictions on democratic debate, broader delegations of authority to unelected experts, and more aggressive suppression of dissenting voices. What begins as temporary measures to address specific challenges evolves into permanent restrictions on democratic participation. The solution requires recognizing that democracy's value lies not in producing correct outcomes, but in providing legitimate procedures for collective decision-making under conditions of moral and empirical uncertainty. When we abandon these procedures in pursuit of righteous goals, we destroy the foundation of legitimate authority in pluralistic societies. Chapter 4: The Expert Delusion. Modern democracies increasingly delegate fundamental political decisions to technocratic experts, creating an illusion of scientific governance while actually undermining democratic accountability. This expert delusion represents a sophisticated form of democratic suicide, as citizens voluntarily surrender political authority to unelected specialists who claim superior knowledge. The appeal is understandable. Complex modern societies face technical challenges that seem to require specialized expertise. Climate policy demands scientific knowledge, economic policy requires understanding of market mechanisms, and social policy benefits from empirical research. Surely, the argument goes, these decisions should be made by experts rather than ignorant masses swayed by demagogues. Yet this technocratic fantasy ignores the fundamentally political nature of these decisions. Scientific expertise can inform us about climate change's mechanisms, but it cannot determine how much current consumption we should sacrifice for future benefits. Economic analysis can predict policy consequences, but it cannot resolve value conflicts about equality versus efficiency. Social science can identify intervention effects, but it cannot settle debates about individual responsibility versus collective obligation. The expert delusion becomes dangerous when technical specialists claim authority over these inherently political questions. Epidemiologists argue that pandemic responses should follow the science, ignoring legitimate debates about balancing health risks against economic and social costs. Climate scientists argue that emissions policies should follow climate models, ignoring legitimate debates about distributing costs across different communities and generations. This technocratic overreach undermines democracy in multiple ways. First, it removes fundamental value questions from democratic debate by disguising them as technical issues with scientific answers. Second, it creates an unaccountable ruling class of credentialed experts whose decisions cannot be challenged through normal political processes. Third, it generates populist backlash as ordinary citizens recognize their exclusion from decisions affecting their lives. The irony is that this expert rule often produces worse outcomes than messy democratic processes. Experts operating within narrow professional frameworks miss interdisciplinary connections that generalist politicians might recognize. Protected from electoral accountability, they pursue theoretical elegance rather than practical effectiveness. Isolated from diverse public input, they develop solutions that work in theory but fail in practice. Historical analysis reveals that technocratic governance typically emerges during democratic crises, as frustrated citizens seek alternatives to ineffective political institutions. Yet technocracy ultimately accelerates democratic decay by removing contentious issues from public debate rather than developing democratic capacity to address them effectively. The solution requires what seems paradoxical: democratizing expertise rather than politicizing democracy. This means creating institutional mechanisms for incorporating technical knowledge into democratic deliberation without allowing experts to substitute their judgment for public choice. It means educating citizens to engage constructively with complex information while maintaining final authority over value-laden political decisions. Chapter 5: The Information Wars. Democracy depends on citizens' capacity to engage in reasoned debate based on shared epistemic standards, but contemporary information warfare systematically undermines this foundation by weaponizing truth itself. When competing factions create alternative reality bubbles that cannot communicate across epistemic divides, democratic deliberation becomes impossible. The current information landscape exhibits characteristics that historical analysis associates with pre-authoritarian periods: the fragmentation of shared truth, the delegitimization of neutral institutions, and the transformation of information consumption into tribal identity markers. Citizens increasingly select news sources not to learn about the world, but to confirm their existing beliefs and strengthen their factional loyalties. This epistemic tribalism creates a deadly dynamic for democratic governance. When different groups operate with incompatible factual premises, political disagreement becomes impossible to resolve through normal democratic means. If one group believes elections are systematically fraudulent while another believes they are fundamentally fair, no amount of democratic deliberation can bridge this gap because the groups lack shared standards for evaluating evidence. The problem extends beyond simple disagreement about facts to disagreement about how facts should be determined. Traditional gatekeeping institutions, mainstream media, universities, government agencies, have lost their authority to certify truth claims. Instead, different factions rely on alternative authorities that confirm their preferred narratives while rejecting inconvenient evidence as propaganda or conspiracy. Social media accelerates this fragmentation by creating algorithmic echo chambers that maximize engagement through confirmation bias. Platforms profit from keeping users engaged, and nothing engages like content that confirms our beliefs while outraging us about our enemies. The result is an information environment optimized for polarization rather than truth-seeking. Yet the response to information warfare often makes the problem worse. Efforts to combat misinformation by censoring disputed claims inevitably become partisan weapons, as each side labels inconvenient truths as dangerous lies. Fact-checking organizations, despite claims of neutrality, reflect the biases of their institutional contexts. Content moderation policies, however well-intentioned, give private corporations unprecedented power to shape public discourse. The deeper issue is that democracy requires not just access to information, but the intellectual virtues necessary to process information constructively: epistemic humility, curiosity about opposing views, willingness to revise beliefs based on evidence, and commitment to truth over tribal loyalty. These virtues cannot be programmed into algorithms or enforced through censorship. They must be cultivated through education and social practice. Historical precedent suggests that societies lose their capacity for democratic governance when they lose their capacity for shared truth-seeking. The collapse of common epistemic standards precedes the collapse of democratic institutions because political compromise becomes impossible when groups cannot agree on basic factual premises. The solution requires rebuilding democratic epistemology from the ground up, creating institutions that reward truth-seeking over tribe-building, educating citizens in critical thinking skills that transcend partisan loyalties, and developing social norms that value intellectual honesty over ideological purity. This represents perhaps the greatest challenge facing contemporary democracy. Chapter 6: Constitutional Erosion. Democracy commits suicide not through dramatic constitutional conventions or military coups, but through the gradual erosion of constitutional norms that protect democratic competition. This process is particularly insidious because it occurs through legal mechanisms that maintain constitutional appearances while hollowing out constitutional substance. The American constitutional system depends on both formal rules and informal norms that constrain political competition within democratic bounds. Formal rules like elections and judicial review provide the framework, but informal norms like accepting electoral defeat, respecting institutional independence, and treating political opponents as legitimate participants make the system function effectively. Contemporary American politics exhibits systematic erosion of these constitutional norms across multiple dimensions. Electoral norms have weakened as parties increasingly question the legitimacy of unfavorable results and seek to manipulate voting procedures for partisan advantage. Judicial norms have eroded as courts become viewed as partisan instruments rather than neutral arbiters. Legislative norms have collapsed as procedures designed to encourage deliberation and compromise are abandoned in favor of pure majoritarianism. The mechanism is typically reciprocal escalation. One side abandons a norm in pursuit of short-term advantage, providing justification for the other side to abandon related norms in retaliation. Republicans block Obama's Supreme Court nomination, so Democrats threaten to pack the court. Democrats eliminate the filibuster for judicial appointments, so Republicans extend the elimination to Supreme Court appointments. Each violation creates precedent for further violations. This constitutional erosion is particularly dangerous because it occurs within the formal legal framework. Unlike obvious coups that openly reject constitutional authority, norm erosion maintains constitutional language while transforming constitutional practice. Elections continue, but their legitimacy is constantly questioned. Courts continue functioning, but their independence is systematically undermined. Legislatures continue meeting, but their deliberative function disappears. The tragedy is that this erosion typically begins with reasonable-sounding justifications. Faced with unprecedented obstructionism, why shouldn't the majority party eliminate procedural obstacles? Faced with partisan court packing, why shouldn't the other side respond in kind? Faced with threats to democracy, why shouldn't emergency measures be employed? Each individual decision seems defensible, but collectively they transform the constitutional system. International comparison reveals that this process of constitutional erosion has preceded democratic breakdown in multiple contexts. Hungary's Viktor Orbán and Poland's Law and Justice Party have systematically undermined democratic institutions while maintaining constitutional forms. Venezuela's Hugo Chavez transformed a democracy into an authoritarian system through legal mechanisms that never formally abolished democratic institutions. The American system's federal structure and separation of powers provide more resistance to constitutional erosion than parliamentary systems, but they also create more opportunities for norm violations. When different parties control different institutions, each has incentives to weaponize their institutional advantages against political opponents rather than preserving institutional integrity for the long term. The solution requires what seems impossible in polarized environments: mutual constitutional restraint based on long-term institutional interests rather than short-term political advantages. This means accepting that constitutional norms sometimes protect your enemies, recognizing that today's minority might be tomorrow's majority, and valuing democratic stability over immediate political gains. Ultimately, constitutional preservation requires citizens who understand that democracy's survival depends not just on following formal rules, but on maintaining the informal norms that make formal rules work effectively. Chapter 7: The Path to Democratic Renewal. Democratic renewal requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. The greatest threat to democracy comes not from external enemies but from democracy's own internal contradictions and the gradual abandonment of democratic virtues by democratic citizens. Preventing democratic suicide demands both institutional reforms and cultural transformation that address the root causes of democratic decay. The institutional dimension focuses on strengthening democracy's structural defenses against authoritarianism. This includes reforming primary systems that reward extremism over moderation, creating stronger protections for voting rights and electoral integrity, establishing more robust checks on executive power, and developing better mechanisms for incorporating technical expertise into democratic deliberation without surrendering democratic control. Yet institutional reforms alone cannot address democracy's deeper vulnerabilities. Democratic institutions only function effectively when supported by democratic culture, shared commitments to civic virtues like tolerance, intellectual honesty, epistemic humility, and willingness to accept legitimate electoral defeat. Without these cultural foundations, even the best institutional design cannot prevent democratic breakdown. Cultural renewal requires educational transformation that prioritizes democratic citizenship over partisan indoctrination. This means teaching students to engage constructively with opposing viewpoints rather than avoiding ideological contamination. It means developing critical thinking skills that help citizens evaluate complex information rather than simply confirming pre-existing beliefs. It means cultivating intellectual virtues that enable productive disagreement in pluralistic societies. The role of intellectual leadership becomes crucial in this renewal process. Public intellectuals must model the kind of rigorous, independent thinking that democracy requires while resisting the temptation to become partisan advocates. Universities must reclaim their function as spaces for genuine inquiry rather than ideological training grounds. Media institutions must prioritize truth-seeking over audience engagement and tribal reinforcement. Perhaps most importantly, democratic renewal requires what I call principled moderation, not the wishy-washy centrism that splits every difference, but the intellectually rigorous commitment to democratic principles even when they protect your political enemies. This means defending free speech for ideas you despise, accepting electoral outcomes you dislike, and maintaining institutional norms even when violating them would provide short-term advantages. The historical record suggests that democratic renewal is possible but requires conscious effort and sustained commitment. Post-war European democracies recovered from fascist catastrophes by developing stronger democratic institutions and more robust civic cultures. American democracy survived the Civil War by eventually expanding democratic participation while strengthening constitutional protections. Yet renewal also requires honest recognition of democracy's limitations. Democracy cannot solve every social problem, satisfy every moral demand, or eliminate every source of human disagreement. Expecting democracy to deliver perfect outcomes inevitably leads to disappointment and the search for non-democratic alternatives. Democratic maturity means accepting that democracy provides legitimate procedures for managing disagreement rather than mechanisms for achieving perfect justice. The alternative to democratic renewal is democratic suicide, the gradual transformation of free societies into authoritarian systems through the abandonment of democratic principles by democratic citizens. This transformation can occur gradually enough that many citizens never recognize what they have lost until it is too late to recover it. The choice facing contemporary America is stark: recommit to the intellectual and civic virtues that sustain democratic life, or continue the spiral of polarization, norm erosion, and constitutional breakdown that historical analysis reveals as the pathway to authoritarian rule. The outcome depends not on distant political elites but on ordinary citizens' willingness to choose democratic principles over tribal loyalties. Conclusion: democracy's survival in America depends on citizens rediscovering what it means to be democratic, not just in formal political participation, but in the habits of mind and character that make democratic life possible. The warning signs are clear: intellectual conformity replacing critical thinking, tribal loyalty overwhelming civic duty, ideological certainty displacing empirical inquiry, and partisan advantage trumping constitutional principle. Yet history also teaches that democratic renewal remains possible when citizens choose democratic virtues over authoritarian temptations. This requires the courage to defend principles even when they protect our enemies, the humility to recognize our own fallibility, and the wisdom to value long-term institutional health over short-term political victories. The path forward demands what seems impossible in our polarized age, treating political opponents as fellow citizens rather than existential threats, seeking truth rather than confirmation, and choosing democratic means even when they frustrate our preferred outcomes. Only by recommitting to these democratic fundamentals can America avoid the historical fate of democracies that committed suicide through the gradual abandonment of the principles that made them free. The choice is ours, but the window for choosing is closing. Democracy's enemies need not storm the barricades when democracy's friends abandon the walls.